A very warm welcome to all of you to this second expert talk at the Institute of Architecture and Landscape at the Graz University of Technology. We're really happy to have our speaker for today, Cymene Howe, and we're really happy to have her voice now today within this format and to put her thoughts within our semester topic, Dasein ist Co-Design towards collective livelihoods in post-pandemic times. So welcome to you all. Welcome, Cymene. I will just start with a short biographical note. So Cymene Howe is professor of anthropology at Rice University, Houston, Texas. Her books include Intimate Activism, published by Duke University Press in 2013, and Ecologics, Wind and Power in the Anthropocene, published by Duke in 2019. Which follows the human and more than human lives intertwined with renewable energy futures. She is co-editor of the Johns Hopkins Guide to Critical and Cultural Theory and Anthropocene Unseen, a lexicon, published by Punctum this year. Her current research on cryo-human relations examines the changing dynamics between human populations and bodies of ice in the Arctic region and sea level adaptation in coastal cities all around the world. So again, we're very happy to have you tonight and welcome, Cymene. And without further ado, I'll just hand over the mic to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Christoph and Klaus and Patricia for the invitation. I'm really thrilled to be here today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge first, though, even though I'm coming to you digitally over the internet, obviously, I want to acknowledge that I am now standing on what was Akakisa land, originally occupied by the Akakisa people, and that prior to European colonialism, that this land belonged to them, near the Galveston Bay and near the San Jacinto River. So I want to acknowledge that disposition very fully. As I begin here, let's see, I need to get to my screen share. Okay, so, are you able to see my screen? Great.
We are.
So you might think that this actually is a typo or a mistake as a title slide, but in fact, it is the title slide that I want to share with you. That is, it is not okay, or as you will see in this discussion, that it is not ok. I am an anthropologist, trained as an anthropologist, and I'm now coming to think of myself as an anthropologist of the Anthropocene. In my field, I've been very involved in the conversation about more than human life, more than human others, or what has been called multi-species ethnography in the discipline of anthropology, all of which is related to a larger ontological turn in the discipline, which has also, of course, been a debate within the discipline. And through this, I've been drawn into what to me now feels much more like an elemental turn, a turn to not only other forms of life in the form of species or other biotic life, but in non-life forms that compose our ontological worlds. So these are things like stone and wind and ice, a kind of elemental turn in our thinking. This brought me to the Arctic, to Iceland, where a handful of years ago, I began a field research project called MELT, the social life of ice at the top of the world. Now, the MELT project put me into conversation with people like Guthfinna Athelgersdottir, a glaciologist who you see here holding her yellow pencil, where she's measuring ice loss atop Solheim Glacier. She takes a group of students there every summer to see the ablation events, the loss of ice and melt atop this glacier in Iceland. But the project also had me speaking to people like Gudni Arnarsson, a sheep farmer who lives in the eastern part of the country, who has lived his entire life with a glacier in his backyard. Now, the MELT project also brought me to this mountaintop because in the summer of 2016, I came across a short news article, really short, very brief. It was only 43 words long in total. And it said that the first of Iceland's major glaciers had been lost to climate change. And that glacier had been called Ok. So here was a glacier with a truly endearing name, OK, or Ok in Icelandic. And that tiny report said that Ok had lost so much of its icy corpus, so much of its cryo body, that it could no longer be classified as a glacier. It could no longer move, and thus was now only dead ice. So as I tried to find out more about Ok, I found that there was almost nothing about this little glacier. No one seemed to have noticed its passing or its death, or paid much attention, not in Iceland and not anywhere else either. But in that search, I learned too, from an Icelandic linguist, that Ok Mountain could actually write its own name in snow and stone. Here you see the top of Ok Mountain, the crater of this extinct shield volcano. And we have a circle with a C inside it. In ancient Icelandic, Ok Mountain in the manuscripts of ancient Icelandic would have been spelled O-C. Nowadays it's spelled OK. But here you see from an aerial point of view that the mountain is in fact writing its own name in snow and stone. I think of it as a kind of lithic signature that it's drawing across the landscape of itself. And talking to Icelanders about their knowledge about Ok and the loss of it, I kept returning to questions about how to acknowledge the death of something that was in fact never actually alive. And if one were to create a memorial or a recognition for a dead glacier, what form would that memorial take? What kind of form should it take? And of course, would anyone care? Given the faint attention that Ok had received when it expired in the year 2014, I wondered whether, in fact, anyone would care about the loss of this little glacier. Now, my collaborator and I found ourselves quite committed to acknowledging this death of a glacier, especially because it was the first of Iceland's major glaciers to be lost to climate change, and the country is called Iceland. So in creating that memorial, we spoke to the very talented Icelandic author and poet Andri Snær Magnusson and asked him if he would write the words for such a memorial plaque. And there was a real logic behind asking an Icelandic author and poet to write the words, because as anthropologists, as people from the global north, we wanted to be very cautious and careful about imposing our words and our language into this space that is an Icelandic space and not belonging to the United States. That kind of colonial move was not something that we wanted to reproduce. So Andre wrote the words, and he entitled this A Letter to the Future. You see at the top, it's first written in Icelandic and then in English. And the letter to the future says, Ok is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. And it ends with the sentiment, only you know if we did it. Below that is the date of the installation of the memorial, August 2019. and the amount of carbon dioxide recorded in the atmosphere at the Mauna Loa site, 415 parts per million, which was the reading at that time. So this very simple message, but a poetic one, I believe, began to circulate widely in social media in spaces like Twitter. And the recognition started to spread that there had never been a memorial for a glacier killed by global warming. This would be the first, and it seemed to strike a chord globally. Soon, the story was appearing all over the world. In The Guardian, for example, in the UK, the BBC, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, People Magazine, National Geographic, CNN, and reports began to appear on television in the UK, in the United States, Australia, India, Germany, Switzerland. All told, we lost track of the stories that were being produced in the global media about the loss of Åkjøkult and the memorial to it. But we estimate that it's over 10,000 outlets that shared the story, including quite unusual media outlets like the US-based magazine called Popular Mechanics, which is a car magazine, an automobile magazine, and Elle magazine, of course, the global fashion and beauty magazine, all had stories about this little glacier in Iceland. At one moment, you see here in the left-hand corner, it even shared the front page with this monster, our former president of the United States, on the CNN site. So as you will see, the funeral that we hosted on top of the mountain that day was solemn, but not sad. There was more conviction about action, a conviction to do better, rather than an outpouring of tears. We start to think about what some of us humans have done to the planet. So come on over, don't be shy.
You want to come in?
Get your hands in there. Keep pushing.
This is the first Icelandic glacier that's formally declared an ex-glacier. But if the predictions of the scientists, if we see them happening, we will see other glaciers disappear in the next decades and centuries, which is obviously a very big thing for our landscape, nature, ecosystem, but also for our energy system, because we produce renewable energies from the glacial rivers. I think it's so important for every leader of the world to be conscious of that we are seeing the faces of the climate crisis differently around the world, but it's the same crisis.
So in the end, this is really a story about a little dead glacier that was never actually alive, a paradox, and that yet had a certain kind of vitality. It is a story about a loss that went almost unrecognized until it wasn't, and how the world seemed not to care until it did. But it's also a story, I believe, about cryo-human relations, or the encounters between ice and people, as well as a parable in collaborative living or dying with one another. And if you'd like, today, you can climb to the top of Auk Mountain and see that letter to the future at the site where Auk Glacier used to reside. And if you do go there, you will see that a tiny lake has formed, the newest lake in all of Iceland. It's called Blauvatn, or Blue Lake, the newest of Iceland's lake, born from the glacier that found its end on the top of Auk Mountain.
Thank you very much, Cymene, for sharing with us this wonderful project, but also sharing with us your approach to the world, sharing with us how to encounter what we call the Anthropocene. And I think this is just wonderful and so also inspiring for us now to hear about this approach, and also to think this approach now also together with what we are now doing at our studio, and when we also think about a totally new, different approach to our world, or a totally new language. Like I was so fascinated also by simply you sharing with us that this glacier basically has its own language. So and I think this is just beautiful, and also now building on what you just shared with us and what we also have seen in the video, that this aspect of memorialization, this practice of memorialization, also has an intimate link also to politics, to society, to what we are, and to how we behave and how we act in this world. So in that regard, I would like to thank you again, and share with you a question, or actually raise a question that that we discussed among our students, and that also our students are interested to ask or to raise, and to hear about also your your answer to this question. So it somehow relates also to this aspect of politics that we've just seen in also the video. And the question is also about a short passage of an article that we reviewed together, where you say in the article "Verdant Optimism on How Capitalism Will Never Save the World" from March this year, you write that there are pathways, and I quote, "There are pathways to better political, social, and ecological futures. To achieve them, we need to leave capitalism behind," end of quote. So we were now wondering, also given this global state of emergency, do you think capitalism can be left behind also fast enough to slow down or even to stop global warming? And if so, which changes are needed, and also what contribution can particularly architects and designers make, in your opinion? Or I would maybe add, which language they have to speak.
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful question. And I just want to reflect too, Christoph, I love the idea of, as you said, a kind of glacial language. I think that's a really beautiful way of thinking about it, especially because in a kind of anthropomorphic way, the traditional association, the scientific association of language is with human capacity, the human capacity for speech, the use of symbols, and this notion that only human beings have language and can communicate in that way. So thinking of this idea of sort of glacial communication or lithic or cryo communication is a really, really interesting direction that might be good to talk about as well. So the slowing of capitalism, it will take us all, would be my first response to that. Is it possible to slow its effects in time? We have very few years left as we listen to the IPCC on the reports of greenhouse gas emissions. That slowed a bit with the beginning of the pandemic. You might have been following that news, but not nearly the reduction that I would have believed, given the downturn in travel and car travel. In fact, the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions at the beginning of the pandemic, even during the most severe shutdowns and lockdowns, was not quite the reduction that we would imagine. That gave me pause in the sense that here you had much of the world, not the entire world, but much of the world shut down to economic activity, at least that kind of economic activity that requires moving from place to place and going to buildings and visiting markets. And yet it didn't really dip the greenhouse gas emissions in the ways that we might imagine. So what that suggests to me is that the kinds of changes we're going to need to make are truly going to be vast, deep, and consequential, and in fact involved in every sector of our society. I mean, we often turn to governments to regulate and to control the activities of businesses and individuals, no more so than here in the United States has there been a rejection of that. which has been a real downfall in terms of managing the climate crisis and utter stupidity in so many ways. But we cannot just rely on governments to take responsibility for shifting these dynamics. And the route of capitalism is a case in point. So we need to look also to the economic sectors, to the corporate sectors, by whatever appeals it takes, for them to make the changes that are necessary. And whether that's through corporate shaming of bad practices that are idle, or whether it is through incentives, that's up for us as a collective body of human beings who are also at times consumers to apply pressure in that way. So there are many different approaches. We need to think through our educational systems, we need to think through our transportation systems, government regulation, corporate and economic regulation, in order to turn the tides on the conditions of emissions that we currently face. Before doing this work in the Arctic, I was working in Mexico on renewable energy, which in the parlance of the climate crisis is called climate change mitigation. That is the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, reducing the number of greenhouse gas emissions that we have. So the project in Mexico was quite instructive because it looked at the multidimensional sort of components of transforming energy systems. And what that work really showed, and this is part of the inspiration for the verdant optimism, which is a reference to Lauren Berlant's cruel optimism, is that we can have an imaginary of green transformation, but if it doesn't take into account the communities and affected parties where those sorts of industrial changes take place, then it will not be a transition that is sustainable in the long term, or that is equitable in terms of its outputs and its mission. So there's a call for a kind of a collective set of actions, clearly. And those collective actions will probably mean a disassembling of the neoliberal regimes in which we all now live. And a piecemeal way is likely not the direction that it will take. It will likely take much stronger sort of cohesion and collective action in order to transform our energy systems, our environmental responses, our conditions of human living, to make the difference that will be necessary for those sorts of less ecocidal trajectories to continue.
Thank you, Cymene. I think this is just beautiful what you just said, also pointing out actually the layer of community, the aspect of collective action. And I was just reminded now also on what you say in the Anthropocene Unseen, when you mention to put the value on smaller scales, or to value smaller scales. Always when we say scale, for us, it always also has a quite architectural association then as well. But then in the same paragraph here, you also speak about intimate forms of life. And I think this beautifully resonates now with also this collective, this call for collective action, or for this communal aspect, which we are also now trying to bring together with our tasks as architects and designers. So how can we also design in a collaborative, in a collective way, and how might we also take into account those smaller scales, be it like literally or be it more metaphorically, and what could also be an intimate form of living that is maybe much more inclusive than our practices that we know until now. So I would be interested in this notion of the smaller scales, and so how it resounds in your thinking and also in your artistic practice, and also what you how you would understand these intimate forms of living and being together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the Anthropocene unseen, it's all the pieces are not entirely by anthropologists, but many of them are. And so I think that there is a kind of anthropological orientation towards intimacy, towards proximity, towards working in small communities with a handful of individuals or a dozen or two individuals over a longer period of time, which is quite distinct from the sociological approach or set of methods, which emphasizes large demographic changes, large surveys, working with many people for a short amount of time. And so this idea of intimacy, proximity, and depth is something that is integrated into the kind of anthropological imaginary or the anthropological methodology. And so I think you're seeing that coming through in this discussion of the Anthropocene as well. Because the discussions of the Anthropocene, as we all know, can be quite overwhelming in their scale. It is quite difficult for us human beings to imagine, for example, the deep history of geologic time going back billions of years. It's very hard for us as sentient beings who live for a very short amount of time on this earth to kind of take into account the scale of geologic time that the Anthropocene demands, both in its history and in its future. It's also very difficult for us as human beings to imagine truly a global reckoning. How do we sort of take into account the many billions of people who we want to collaborate with, who we want to be in communication with in order to make the changes that we need to. So these are scales that are challenging for us as human beings, but they're not impossible. They just, it requires a kind of reconfiguring, a reimagining of how we work with scale. And so I think this question of intimacy is a very good one. And in the work on multi-species and kind of neo-feminist, neo-ecofeminist work, I found a lot of inspiration in the work of Jane Bennett, for example, and Stacy Alaimo, who are really looking at these very micro dimensions of scale. So the way that the kind of microbial affects our bodily forms, the way that we are composed of different bacterial forms in addition to our organs and our brains. So the kind of normative imaginary of our bodies is being reimagined through some of these particularly feminist approaches, which of course owe a lot to Donna Haraway as well. But Stacy Alaimo's notion of the transcorporeal, for example, that we do not end at the skin, that we have an absorptive capacity, we absorb toxic chemicals, we absorb vitamin D through the sun. There's all kinds of ways in which our bodies are not our own, if we think of ourselves as kind of singular beings that are encapsulated in the normative ways that we feel being human. And so there's, I think, a lot of really interesting openings for rethinking what it means to be human, and therefore how to be human with one another and in collaboration with one another. And so I know that architects and architecture has been fascinated with scale for a long time, and it's a very interesting domain of thinking. In the last 10 to 15 years or so, anthropologists have also become fairly interested in scale, particularly around questions of infrastructure. Globalization, obviously, is another kind of scale that we saw, with the end of the Cold War and the advent of neoliberal capitalism. So this moving between scales is an art and a practice that we should practice more. But we need to find those kinds of routes and passages in which to be able to do that.
Well, I would like to, take up your string of thought in this moment, because I had a discussion this morning with my students at our workshop, and we were discussing disciplinary boundaries, and because that is, of course, also a question of scale in that regard, defining a certain domain of thinking. And which is counterproductive in the way that you just described, right? That we should go think beyond the skin eventually. And if I take this as a literal aspect, right? Beyond the skin of a building, right? We should think about what, how does the building metabolism, participate in a global metabolism. And with this single sentence, right, we are just going beyond any scale, and we are global, right, in that regard. And that is, of course, takes a lot of space to think everything together always at the same time. But nevertheless, I think it's important to have those moments, right, where you reach out and understand whatever I'm doing, deciding on materials. In the first place, I have impact on a global scale, even if it's hard to grasp and to understand. But also, I think design-wise, conceptually, I think the same applies, right? The building doesn't stop at the outer facade, it doesn't stop at the skin. And maybe you can jump in it at that point where, because there's so many parallels to your own research.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I love that the metabolism of a building. Is that common language in architecture? Is that a kind of discourse that is common, or did you just create that?
I think it's developing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's super interesting. Yeah, I mean, in a couple of different ways. I mean, again, going back to the human and going back to Donna Haraway, I think her discussion about, how we will all eventually become humus, that is the kind of microbial soil of the earth, right? The ashes to ashes, dust to dust kind of logic and orientation, is that there's a kind of a temporal scale that's important in any discussion of anything that exists, either living or not. So we think about human lifespans and what becomes of them, what becomes of bodies once they have expired. But we can also think about the lifespan or the duration of certain built environments, buildings, monuments, temples, some of which are meant to have a lifespan that is quite durable, some of which are meant to last for a very temporary amount of time. I live in the city of Houston, Texas, which, and I think as architects you'll appreciate this, has a very fast, very quick replacement rate. I don't even know if that's the right term, but a replacement rate of buildings, where the average lifespan of a building in Houston is something like 30 years or 35 years. That's the average. So that's including, a wonderful church that might be 150 years old, and then averaging that out with buildings that literally are standing for a handful of years before the business dies out and they want to build a new building because they want to have a new facade, and look for the building. So I live in this space that's hyper transformative in that way, but of course that's quite bad environmentally and for climate and emissions and the kind of the greenhouse gases that are produced through rebuilding and rebuilding again these spaces. In the anthropology of infrastructure, which has been an interesting and kind of burgeoning field, one of the things that I found most interesting in terms of these built environments is that buildings or other infrastructures like bridges or dams, anything that's built on sort of human building and architecture needs to be built for its own destruction, its own ruination, the end of its life. And that the best engineers can do is to engineer something that will die well, that will fall to ruin in an appropriate way at the right time, in the right form. And this was an insight to me, and perhaps this is more well known in the architecture community. It was an insight to me because I imagine the building of things as the point of creation, the kind of origin story of the building or space itself, and then its duration. But I hadn't really ever thought about its moment of expiration and how important that is in the life cycle of a building. But of course it is. But that moment of expiration, I think, is very interesting. And, and again, I mean, to bring it back to the story of Okyokot, its moment of expiration has resulted in this brand new lake on the top of Oak Mountain, Blue Lake, which is actually home to several different species of creatures that are called extremophiles. These are creatures like tardigrades that can only live in very extreme environments, like a glacial lake. But it's fascinating to me that the death of auk, caused by human habits and human practice and the climate crisis, its death has now created this space of life on top of the mountain and full of biotic creatures who will go and tell a different story in their lifespan.
Yeah, I think this is quite an interesting point to make, that to draw that parallel between this project of yours. I'm just wondering, because I think of that glacier as something that maybe didn't really die from the perspective of the glacier. I think it might be our perspective, which is pretty important, right, to recognize that. But maybe the glacier transformed its presence into part of the ocean or part of the atmosphere. So as again talking about metabolism, as this is a process of metabolism, for the glacier, I'm just wondering, how that could apply for design, for architecture, for cities, right? Because we just tend to think of those materials that are remaining, a building that has been destroyed as trash, basically. The idea of recycling, of a real metabolism, I think it's slowly taking on, and there of course are initiatives that very strongly argue for a material approach that is completely cyclical. The question would be, right, how from your experience, how we could enter that process, instantly or much quicker than this may happen over the next maybe 10, 20, 15, 20 years, which is probably, a time frame that we could, expedite quite a bit, once we have found the right approach to communicate, those systems.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think you're right. There still is time to kind of reverse the worst effects. And so the question becomes, how do we do so? There's been a very interesting debate across the social sciences and humanities about the utility of this term Anthropocene. And some of those debates have cycled around the question of whether to place Anthropos at the center of this new geologic epoch called the Anthropocene, or whether that's just another act of sort of human aggrandizement of this pinnacle species that's lauding its accomplishments once again in the form of, look, we've become so influential that we're transforming all of the Earth systems on the planet, the lithosphere, the biosphere, the hydrosphere, the cryosphere, the atmosphere. All of these spaces, all these Earth systems now have human imprint within them everywhere on Earth. So there is an impact and an effect that's been created by a collective anthropos. But of course, that impact and effect differs and is quite distinct depending on which historical epoch you lived, which historical era you occupy, and of course, how intensively any human habit is upon the planet. So that brings us to a concept that's been called the Capitalocene, which I'm sure you've been reading about as well, which places the beginning of this incredible and destructive impact of humanity at the beginning of capitalism and its exercise of economic dominion, which again became truly dominion at the end of the Cold War. Prior to that, we had two different spaces of economic reckoning, one capitalist and the other communist. So that's one of the issues with the Capitalocene, in my reckoning, is that it doesn't quite account for that period prior to the full-fledged neoliberal outputs of capitalist dominion. But the other issue with the Capitalocene, from my point of view, is that it relies very heavily, in fact, exclusively on the economic system as the response, as both the cause and the possible answer to radical changes that need to be made in order to and the climate crisis, and to come into better equilibrium with the biospheres that we occupy. So as an anthropologist, I recognize and appreciate the important role that economy has to play in all of our lives. These different economic systems control and manipulate our lives in many ways. In some ways, it feels like beyond our control. But at the same time, we do also have other systems of interaction and interchange and collectivity that we can draw upon. Some of those live under the aegis of culture, some of them under society, some of them under kinship, under gender, sexual orientation. There's so many ways in which we interact with and encounter one another and our ecological spaces, that to me it seems a mistake to devolve the entire question to one of economic systems. Now, I don't want to reduce the nefarious and long-standing impact of capitalism upon the environment and upon our lives, hence this article and much of my other writing. That's certainly a factor, but there are many other ways in which we are human too. There are many other ways in which we are human that is beyond the economic system or that is in parallel to it. And so what I think we can do is draw attention to those other ways of encountering one another. And part of that is in our built environment and the ways that we are able to connect with each other or not, given those built environments and the capacities of those built environments. Mm. So that's a space where architecture and design and engineering and infrastructures can all sort of come together in a collective way, and perhaps in an interdisciplinary way. And you brought that up too, Klaus, and I think that is important. It's challenging to do, but it is the work that we need to do with one another across these different, they call them disciplinary divides. I don't think that's a very good way of thinking about it. These disciplinary or methodological differences, but it's fascinating to learn about them and try and create those parallels, those networks, those relationships that will make a difference, because the problems of the Anthropocene, the problems of the climate crisis, of ecological disequilibrium are profound and widespread, and they are the issues of our times. And it's the problem is of such magnitude that we really do need to collaborate and work together in order to make the changes that will make a difference.
Yeah, thank you, Cymene. I think this is precisely why your work is just so inspiring, because when you're now talking about that there are many other ways of being human, and speaking about also the transcorporeal before, I'm also then wondering if we somehow project this onto architecture, maybe architecture becomes something transmaterial, or even in the way you say, in like a trans-species space or a spatial condition that is much more than the corporeal or the material, but it's actually in a transitive condition. And when you then say there are many other ways of being human, I think this also includes, of course, there are many other ways of living together. There are many other ways also of designing and of conceiving architecture in its very material form. So I just was just taking a look now on our time, and I think we're already quite over our time that we set. So at this point, I somehow want to thank you, Cymene, for this really so inspiring conversation. And I think this is not just opening also so many different fields, and I think this is precisely where also we want to go, and I think where we can find also this other ways, or also this spirit of experimentation that is so much more hopeful also than the kind of hegemonic narratives of the Anthropocene that are all around. So,
well,
sorry.
Yeah, well, thanks to you all. Thanks to everyone in the audience who I can't quite see, but thank you too for these wonderful questions. They were really stimulating and have me thinking about new dimensions as well. So I appreciate what you're doing with the workshop and with the project, and I'll look forward to seeing all the other presentations once they get created and developed. It's exciting very timely work that you're doing. So I want to appreciate that too.
Well, thank you so much for your appreciation, and we'd love to share our ideas and experiments that we are working on right now in the next weeks and months, and would be very curious to to learn about your thoughts and hear your feedback to that. Yeah,
that would be great. That would be great. Let's stay in contact.
Yes, let's do that.
I think that's okay.
That's okay. Yes. Excellent. That's okay. More than okay. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you, Cymene. Take good care.
Bye. You too. Bye-bye.
And thanks to everyone, and we'll see each other again next week at our the forthcoming talk. So see you there and have a nice evening.